To start off our exploration of William Shakespeare, we look at this cartoon of him with a cell phone in his hand as he is tweeting. We know that because the stop bubble says, Twitter. Now, it says to be or not to be that he's texting, a little winky face. And hopefully that line sounds familiar to you. It's a very famous line from Hamlet, which is one of Shakespeare's plays. I'd like you to think about, why is this funny? Why does this tweet make us laugh? Is it something about who is texting? Is it what is being texted? Think about that as we move forward. So obviously we're talking about William Shakespeare today. We're going to try to figure out who in fact he is and why we should care about him. So William Shakespeare was an Elizabethan playwright and poet, and all that means is that he wrote during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, who is pictured down here in a famous portrait. Okay. So she reigned in England from 1558 to 1603, and this was a very important time in British history. Here are some interesting things that happened during this time. Sir Francis Drake circumnavigated the globe, which means he went all the way around, circum from the Latin meaning around, so he navigated around the whole earth. It was at this time that great art and literature was being created as part of the European Renaissance. You might have heard about that in either history class or maybe even an art class. On a more negative note, you also had the bubonic plague at this time, also known as the Black Death, which broke out in London. It killed about a third of the European population during this time period, and certainly a lot of those in England. And a favorite fun fact of students from the past, the potato was first introduced to England during this period as well. And of course, Shakespeare was writing. Under Queen Elizabeth I's reign, theater thrived with such famous playwrights as William Shakespeare, Ben Jonson, Christopher Marlowe, and Thomas Kyd. Which of these playwrights have you heard of? It is my guess that you've probably heard of William Shakespeare, but Jonson, Marlowe, and Kyd might be people you have not heard of at all. So thinking a little bit more about the theater, Elizabethan theater is much different than the theater that we know today. You're going to read more about it in an excerpt from Bill Bryson later this week, but here are some highlights. Theaters were actually located outside of the city proper. So when we go to New York or into Boston to see a show, we are right sort of in the downtown area, right? If you've been to either city in their theater district, it's right sort of in the middle of that bustling hub. But in the Elizabethan era, they were outside of the city proper because it was considered a form of low entertainment. So it wasn't proper to be inside the city walls itself. At this time, only men could be actors. No women were allowed on stage, so female roles were usually played by boys, actually about your age, about 13 or 14, sometimes a little bit younger. There were some pretty limited special effects, as you might imagine, without as much technology as we have today. There tended to be fairly little scenery and costumes, but there was plenty of gore. They would use actual animal blood or animal intestines, whatever the case might be, to produce some kind of icky, gory effects. Another important point is that all sorts of people came to see the plays. Seats were priced differently so that most people could afford the groundlings area, which you'd be standing in, but the aristocracy could afford the balcony seats, which would give you a nice view of everything. So this is still the case in a lot of theaters today. We have the orchestra seats, which are very close to the stage. They tend to be pretty expensive, and then the mezzanine seats are in the back. They tend to be a lot cheaper since they're further from the stage, and you don't get to see as much. So that is a similar thing to what we see in today's theater. Shakespeare's theater that he personally owned and operated with a lot of his plays was called the Globe, and here's a video showing you all about that.
Behind me is Shakespeare's theatre, rebuilt recently, but it was originally constructed in the 17th century, and its name is the Globe, which comes from the expression everyone in the world is an actor. The conditions at the time when this would have been built were very different from the way actors work now. It was all done during the day because they didn't have enough money to afford candles to put on the plays at night. So there would have been far more interaction between the public and the actors. And in fact, the groundlings, which were the cheapest seats just under the open cover, they would shout at the actors and throw things at them if they didn't like the play. At the time as well, none of the actors were women because they weren't allowed to be in plays. And also the church was very critical of theatre. It called it the nest of the devil, and it was usually just outside the city walls because it wasn't really allowed in those days. It was seen as something very popular and affordable because, just as I said before, the cheapest seats could be afforded by everyone. So this is where the groundlings stand, and to come here it's only £5 to see a play, and they say it's one of the best places, even though if it rains umbrellas aren't allowed, so you're going to get wet. But they say it would have been the best place as well because the audience participated. So you were right next to the actor's foot. You could see up his nose. And if he spat down at you, as I said, there's no umbrellas allowed. So it would have been a big problem. But there's great participation because the audience can see you, the actors, everybody's involved in the play, which makes kind of a difference from the typical West End play where everybody's in the dark. Here, you felt like you were really part of it.
Zodiac known as the heavens. There's a trapdoor in heaven as well, which is open at the moment. And you come down from heaven on an evening. It does look quite dangerous.
The Globe Theatre puts on plays mainly by Shakespeare, and they're pretty authentic, even down to the finest details, like the original 17th century underwear. So it's probably not that comfortable. And nowadays, we go and see a play, but back then, the most important thing was the acoustics. It was more important that you heard the play. And so wherever you sat, the more expensive seats were the ones that had the best sound. The stage represents three different elements. The top with the zodiac signs that's painted blue represents heaven or the sky. There's even a trapdoor you can come down from. And the stage itself represents the earth. And there's a trapdoor to go underneath, which represents hell. This round shape kind of increases the sense of participation. The building itself, though, was hard to get permission for because, remember, in the 17th century it had burned down twice. So to make this thatched kind of roof after the Great Fire of London was pretty tough to do. It took them 8 years to get permission, but they finally managed to go ahead with it. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Not if it's a summer's day in London.
So that should give you some idea of what Shakespeare's theater looks like today. It would have looked a little bit differently then, but that is the same structure that he had. Obviously a very different structure than we see in theaters today. So who was this mysterious William Shakespeare? On the right side of the screen is a picture of what we suppose must be William Shakespeare, although there is a lot of controversy about whether he was the author of the plays or not. But the man we know as William Shakespeare was born around April 23rd, 1564. The date is not 100% clear. He was born in Stratford-upon-Avon in England. He was probably educated at the King's New School. Again, we don't have any clear data on this, but this is a probable guess, where he would have had a classical education which included Greek and Latin. Shakespeare did not attend university, which is what the British call college. In 1582, Shakespeare married the pregnant Anne Hathaway, not the same as the actress. Her picture is on the right. They had several children together. The subsequent years after their marriage are often called lost years of Shakespeare's life, since we're not sure what he was up to until about the 1590s, when all of a sudden his plays began to appear on stage. So between 1590 and 1592, several of Shakespeare's plays were performed in London theaters. The theaters were then unfortunately closed in 1593 because of the plague. Shakespeare continued to write during that time, and his plays went back on the stage the following year. In 1594, he joined a company known as the Lord Chamberlain's Men, and that was to be his career-long acting company. They became the King's Men in 1603, which meant that the king himself was the person who who was the patron of their company. He paid the money, etc., to perform. So Shakespeare died, we know for sure, on April 23rd, 1616, which is about the same as his birthday. We're not sure if it's exactly the same day of his birth or if it's just close to it, but definitely within that same time frame. If not for the efforts of his friends, his plays might have died with him, since they did not exist in literary form as we see them today. Okay, so back then, actors would get part of a script. They would only have their lines and their opening cues, not a full book with all of the play in it. So it was actually kind of a lot of work for his friends to put it all together. The first folio, containing 36 Shakespearean plays, was published in 1623, about 7 years after his death, which started a process to transform Shakespeare's plays from the stage to literary canon or works that we still read a lot today. So let's talk a little bit more about those plays. A very famous quote here from Hamlet: "The play's the thing wherein I'll catch the conscience of the king." Someday you'll read Hamlet and you'll learn more about that. Although Shakespeare wrote both poetry and plays, and we will be looking at some of his sonnets, his plays are usually what get the most attention. He wrote 3 genres of plays. He wrote tragedies, he wrote comedies, and he wrote history plays as well. Some of his most famous tragedies are up here on screen. So Hamlet is probably one of the most well-known, as well as Othello, Romeo and Juliet, which you will read next year, and Macbeth, my personal favorite, although there was also an excellent interpretation of Coriolanus done, I believe, 2 years ago by Tom Hiddleston in London, which was also excellent. For comedies, some of his most famous are A Midsummer Night's Dream, which we will be reading, Much Ado About Nothing, Twelfth Night, As You Like It, and The Taming of the Shrew. Please notice that on this slide as well as on the previous one, these are all movie adaptations of the plays that have been done relatively recently. It's interesting to think that plays written so very, very long ago are still performed today and have been adapted to movies so many times. And then, of course, his histories, they're usually about British kings, or the British monarchy, I should say, although he does do some others as well. So Henry V, Richard III, and Henry VI, Part 3. This interpretation of Richard III is excellent. It has Ian McKellen in the title role, and it sort of puts the play as if the Nazis had won World War II. So it's an excellent movie. At some point, you will have to see it. So lines from Shakespeare's plays are often referenced in literary works and also in everyday life. So here are some famous ones below. To be or not to be, that is the question. That, of course, is what Shakespeare was texting in that cartoon at the beginning, and that comes from Hamlet. By the twitching of my thumbs, something wicked this way comes, which is referred to, often in other literary works. That comes from Macbeth. Lord, what fools these mortals be. We'll read that line in Midsummer Night's Dream. Cry havoc and let slip the dogs of war. Parting in such sweet sorrow, once more into the breach, dear friends. All of these are lines that you will probably hear again in reading later years or just in everyday life. So thinking about William Shakespeare, the era in which he was writing, the plays he wrote, big question here is, why should we care about him? Why are we still reading him now in 2016 together on Team Kelp? So Shakespeare's words are ever present in the literature we read. He's alluded to constantly by other writers. There are so many adaptations that are done both on stage and still on film today. Why is it that we are still performing and reading and thinking about these works that were written in the late 1500s, early 1600s? That is, in fact, the question we're going to try to tackle in our study of A Midsummer Night's Dream. So stay tuned for more about that.